The Papacy Iceberg, what they never taught you about the Pope. White smoke, secret elections, martyrdom, prophecy, and spiritual war. There's more to the Papacy you've ever been told. Hey everyone, this is Vale and Keys, and this is something I've been wanting to explore for a while now. The Papacy, the Pope, the Chair of Peter. It's one of the most visible, powerful symbols of the Catholic Church, but also one of the most misunderstood. Growing up, I knew the Pope was important. I knew there was something ancient and holy about it. Couldn't have told you where the office came from, what it really meant, or why it's lasted for over 2,000 years. Maybe you're in that same place, or maybe you know a lot already, but you're curious about the deeper stuff, things they don't teach you in school. So I started digging, reading, watching, praying, going down rabbit holes, some theological, some historical, yeah, some downright mysterious. What I found was incredible. This video is structured like an iceberg. At the top, we'll start with the basic stuff. Most Catholics have heard before, but as we descend, we're going to hit some wild stories, ancient prophecies, forgotten saints, and spiritual realities that made me step back and go, whoa. And the deeper we go, the more beautiful and strange it gets. I'm not a theologian, just a Catholic husband, dad, and a guy trying to grow in faith. And this is part of that journey. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever heard that the Pope is literally entrusted with the keys to the kingdom? Or that there's an actual chair of Peter preserved in Rome? Let me know what surprised you the most by the end of the video by leaving a comment. Alright, if you're ready to go deeper, let's begin our descent into the Papacy Iceberg. First stop on our descent is Tier 1 surface level. St. Peter was the first pope. Let's start with the obvious, often unappreciated truth. The very first pope was St. Peter. Yes, Peter the fisherman, the one who denied Jesus 3 times. In Matthew 16:18, Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." That word Peter, Petros in Greek, means rock. And it wasn't just a nickname, it was a calling. Jesus was giving Peter a specific authority. In fact, this moment mirrors a powerful Old Testament reference, Isaiah 22, as where the king gives his chief steward the keys to the kingdom, saying he will open and no one shall shut. Jesus echoes that almost word for word when he gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That's where we get the symbolism you'll see in papal imagery to this day, those gold and silver keys. Peter was the first, and every pope since is part of an unbroken line, the apostolic succession, that was established by Christ himself. Still kind of blows my mind. We can trace a spiritual lineage, Pope Francis today, all the way back to a fisherman in Galilee. Next up, papal fallibility, what it actually means. Okay, this one tripped me up for a long time. I used to think papal infallibility meant the Pope could never make a mistake, like he was some kind of flawless oracle. But the Church does teach that. Infallibility doesn't mean the Pope is perfect. It means that under very specific conditions, the Holy Spirit protects him from teaching error in matters of faith and morals. Specifically, this only applies when he speaks ex cathedra, that means from the chair of Peter, with the intention of binding the whole church. And get this, it's only been used a couple of times in the past 2 centuries. Most famous examples are in 1854 when Pope Pius IX defined the Immaculate Conception, and in 1950, when Pope Pius XII defined the Assumption of Mary. Everything else, even homilies, interviews, and press conferences, aren't infallible. Might be wise, might be questionable. It's not protected in the same way. Find that reassuring that God doesn't expect us to be perfect, just to trust that He'll protect the truth when it matters most. Next up, we have how popes are chosen, the conclave, something very relevant as of today, May 7th, 2025, as they are currently choosing the next pope. This part fascinated me. I always saw the white smoke on the news, but never really understood what was happening. When a pope dies or resigns like Benedict did in 2013, the church enters a process called the conclave. The word conclave literally means with a key, because the voting cardinals are literally locked inside the Sistine Chapel until a decision is made. No phones, no outside contact. Only cardinals under the age of 80 can vote, usually around 120 men. They vote up to 4 times a day, writing names on secret ballots. If no one gets the 2/3 majority, the ballots are burned with a special chemical that creates black smoke. If someone does get elected, the ballots are burned differently, and white smoke pours out. Then comes Latin announcement, Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The new pope chooses a name, steps onto the balcony, and the world meets their new shepherd. Here's the crazy thing. Process that's been largely unchanged for centuries. It's quiet, hidden, and it's completely rooted in prayer. Gave me a lot of peace. We live in a world of endless noise and opinion, but here, the most important decision in the church is made in silence. Next up, we have Pope Francis, our recent pope. Our latest pope was Pope Francis, the 266th pope in the church history. He was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He's the first pope from the Americas, first Jesuit pope, and the first to take the name Francis. His papacy focused on mercy, humility, and care for the poor, but also stirred plenty of discussion. Some people loved him, others did not. But whatever your opinion, can't deny the weight he carried or the impact he made. Under his leadership, he launched the Synod of Synodality, trying to help the church listen more deeply at all levels. He published major encyclicals like Laudato Si, which called for environmental stewardship, and Fratelli Tutti, a reflection of fraternity and social friendship. He reformed the Vatican's financial system, aiming for more transparency and accountability. He canonized lots of saints, like Saint John Henry Newman and Saint Oscar Romero, voices of conscience in their time. And he made historic gestures like visiting Iraq in 2021, becoming the first pope to do so, meeting both Christian refugees and Muslim leaders in a war-torn land. Personally, I try to focus on praying for him. Whether or not I understood every decision he made, I believe that being the Pope is one of the heaviest burdens a man can carry. He recently recovered from a health scare and tragically passed away just a few weeks later. And it reminds me, the Pope is a man, a human being, and he stands in a role that's been preserved by God for over 2,000 years. That's worth reflecting on. Moving on to the last section of this tier, symbols of the papacy. You've probably seen a lot of these before without realizing what they meant. They show up in the photos, artwork, and Vatican broadcasts. Every one of them has a story and a meaning that runs deeper than tradition. Let's start with the white cassock. It goes back to Pope Pius V, who was a Dominican. When he became Pope in the 1500s, he kept wearing his simple white habit instead of switching to the usual red or elaborate garments. It was a quiet decision rooted in humility, and over time, it became the new standard. That's why every pope since has worn white. It's not just a uniform, it's a sign of purity, simplicity, and service. Then there's the ring of the fisherman. This isn't just jewelry, it's a symbol of authority rooted in the identity of Peter as a fisherman called by Christ. Each pope receives a unique ring engraved with Peter casting his net. When a pope dies or resigns, the ring is intentionally destroyed, a powerful reminder that the office continues, but the man does not. It marks the end of his earthly stewardship and the beginning of the church's wait for the next shepherd. You've probably seen the cross keys, too, often in Vatican flags, emblems, or seals. They go all the way back to Matthew 16:19 when Jesus tells Peter, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. One gold, one silver, representing the binding authority in heaven and on earth. That image isn't just artistic, it's theological. The Pope holds the keys not because he's better than others, but because he was entrusted with them to guard, guide, and serve. And then there's the Swiss Guard, those colorful soldiers in Renaissance-style uniforms. At first glance, you might think that they're part of a pageant or parade, but don't be fooled. These are trained, disciplined men who have been defending the Pope since 1506. Their loyalty, courage, and even willingness to die for the Pope isn't symbolic, it's real. Their uniform might be from another century, but their mission is timeless, to protect the successor of Peter. All of these symbols might look like ceremony, but they carry deep spiritual meaning. They tell the story of a man who doesn't sit on a throne to be served, but who stands in the shoes of a fisherman who is given a mission. Pope is many things, a pastor, a teacher, defender of the faith, but above all, he is a servant. And these symbols, they remind us that behind the titles and robes is a role rooted in sacrifice, one given not by men, but by Christ himself. That's the surface of the papacy, but deeper down things get stranger. What happens when mystics have visions of popes? What about prophecies? What about popes who were exiled or martyred or imprisoned? And the next tier, we're heading under the surface into the forgotten corners of papal history. Let's go deeper. Okay, now we go below the surface of the water to Tier 2. Saints, History, and Strange Turns. Tier 1 gave us the basics, the biblical foundation, the white smoke, the ring, the Swiss Guard, but now we go deeper. This tier is where things get more layered, more human, and honestly, more wild. Because the papacy isn't just sacred, it's also survived centuries of war, betrayal, scandal, reform, and exile. And somehow, still stands. First up, we have the Papal States, when the Pope ruled like a king. Something I had no idea about until recently. For over 1,000 years, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was also a sovereign ruler. I always thought the Pope just stayed in the Vatican, wore white, gave speeches, and led the church. But for most of history, he actually ruled over a big chunk of Italy. Real land, real borders, real political power. These territories were called the Papal States. They stretch across what's now central Italy, and the Pope government ran like a monarchy. He collected taxes, ran courts, had his own military, and even minted coins with his image on them. At one point, the church controlled nearly a third of the entire Italian peninsula. It's not just spiritual authority, that's geopolitical influence on a massive scale. It all started in the 8th century when Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, gave lands to the Pope in what became known as the Donation of Pepin. The idea was simple. The Pope would have a safe, independent base from which to lead the church without being under the thumb of any king or emperor. And that arrangement worked for a while. But by the 1800s, the winds of nationalism were rising. Italy wasn't a unified country yet. It was a patchwork of states, duchies, and territories. And as the movement to unify Italy grew stronger, the Papal States became a problem. In 1870, the newly formed Kingdom of Italy invaded and absorbed the Papal States, taking Rome as its capital. The Pope at the time, Pius IX, refused to recognize the takeover, locked himself in the Vatican, and for nearly 60 years the Pope was basically a voluntary prisoner, refusing to set foot outside Vatican walls in protest. He even refused to acknowledge the new Italian state. It was a standoff that lasted until 1929, when Pope Pius XI signed the Lateran Treaty with the Italian government. That agreement created the modern Vatican city-state, a tiny independent nation of just 109 acres, with the Pope at its head of state. So yeah, before there was a Vatican City, there was an entire papal kingdom. The Pope wasn't just a pastor, he was a prince. And I don't know about you, but learning that changed how I see the church's history. It reminded me that the church has always had to navigate power, when to hold it, when to let it go, and how to stay faithful to Christ through it all. Next up, we have the chair of St. Peter, a literal chair. The chair of Peter sounds like a metaphor, and in a sense, it is. It represents the Pope's teaching authority, what the Church calls the magisterium, especially when he teaches definitively on faith and morals ex cathedra, which literally means from the chair. But here's the part that surprised me. Not just symbolic, there's also an actual chair. Inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, way up in the apse, behind the high altar, you'll find a stunning, massive bronze sculpture by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It's called the Cathedra Petri, which means Chair of Peter. At the center of the sculpture, behind the gold and the angels and the ray of light, is a wooden throne encased in bronze. According to tradition, the wooden chair was used by early popes and possibly even St. Peter himself. Now, can we prove absolute certainty that Peter sat on it? Honestly, probably not. And scholars say the physical chair likely dates back to the 4th or 5th century, maybe even earlier. The church doesn't claim infallibility on this. It's not about the archaeology or relic obsession. It's about what the chair represents. This is a church that believes Jesus gave Peter a mission to feed his sheep, to strengthen his brothers, to bind and loose in his name. And the chair is a powerful reminder that this role isn't vague or poetic. It's real. It's anchored in history. It's been handed down through the centuries. In fact, there's an actual feast day for this, February 22nd, the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter. We don't celebrate it because the church loves furniture. We celebrate it because it reminds us that Christ didn't leave us to drift. He gave us a shepherd, he gave us a church, and he gave us that church on a visible center of unity. The Church of Peter isn't about power or prestige. It's about service, teaching, and guarding the faith. And whether that wooden seat held Peter's body or not, it holds something just as important now, the memory of a promise that the church would be built on a rock, and that rock would not break. Next up on our journey, we have Saint Catherine of Siena, the woman who told the Pope what to do. Alright, this story is wild. In the 1300s, the Pope wasn't living in Rome. He was in Avignon, France, far from the tomb of St. Peter, far from the heart of the church. It started as a political move. Rome was unstable, France was powerful, and for nearly 70 years, the popes, 7 in a row, ruled from Avignon instead of the Eternal City. But the consequences were huge. Papacy began to feel distant, disconnected, and frankly, under the thumb of French influence. Morale was low, corruption was creeping in, people were questioning the church's credibility, and it felt like the visible rock was drifting. Enter in St. Catherine of Siena, a Dominican laywoman, a mystic, penitent. She was only in her 20s, had no formal education, and yet she became one of the loudest and clearest voices in the entire Catholic world. And here's what makes her story so powerful. She didn't come with politics or prestige. She came with truth, holiness, and fire. She wrote dozens of letters to church leaders and to the Pope himself, calling them to conversion, reform, and courage. And she did not hold back. Her tone was bold, even fierce at times, but always rooted in love for the church and obedience to Christ. One of her most famous lines of Pope Gregory XI was, "Be a man, fulfill your office." There wasn't disrespect. It was a sister in Christ pleading with the spiritual father to return to his post. Eventually, Catherine traveled to Avignon herself and met with the Pope in person, an unheard of move for a laywoman. She urged him face to face to return to Rome, where Peter's blood had spilled, where the church was meant to be anchored. And a short time later, he did. Pope Gregory XI moved the papacy back to Rome in 1377, ending what we call the Avignon Papacy. Now, that wasn't the end of the drama. We'll get into the Western Schism next, but Catherine's role in that movement was undeniable. She was later declared a doctor of the church, one of only 4 women to receive that title in all of church history. And it's partly because of this, she reminded the Pope to act like Peter again, not with rebellion, not with pride, but with fearless obedience to God's will. That challenges me, because sometimes the Holy Spirit speaks through unexpected voices, not from a pulpit or a throne, but from the margins. And sometimes it's the quiet mystic, the young woman, the hidden intercessor who comes the loudest, all back to truth. On to the next one, the Two Pillars Dream, St. John Bosco's Prophecy of the Church. This one gave me chills the first time I heard it. It's one of those stories that sticks with you, not because it's official doctrine, but because it feels like it captures something true, something real that echoes what we see playing out in church and from the Bible. In the 1860s, St. John Bosco, also known as Don Bosco, had a dream that, now famous in Catholic circles, is called the Dream of the Two Pillars. Now, Don Bosco wasn't just a dreamer. He was a priest, an educator, and a founder. He had a deep devotion to the Eucharist and Our Lady, and he spent his life working with the poor and abandoned youth of Italy. He was known for his holiness and humility, and for the many dreams and vision he shared, especially with his students. And this one? It's probably his most well-known. In the dream, Don Bosco saw the church symbolized as a great ship out on the open sea. The sea is raging, filled with enemy vessels, crashing waves, cannon fire, and chaos. And standing at the helm of the ship is the Pope. He's steering the church through the storm, trying to keep it upright as the world and hell itself seems to close in. But ahead in the distance, rising up from the sea like towers of hope, are two massive pillars. On the top of the first pillar is a large host, the Eucharist, the true presence of Jesus Christ, and on the second is a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary under the title Help of Christians, devotion Don Bosco had a deep love for. As the Pope guides the ships between the two pillars, anchoring the church to them, the battle quiets, the sea calms, and the enemies scatter. The meeting isn't subtle, and that's the beauty of it. Don Bosco didn't claim this was secret code or conspiracy. It was clear. If the church remains anchored to the Eucharist and to Our Lady, she will survive any storm. Not maybe, not hopefully, but will. And in a time like ours, when confusion, scandal, division, hostility are all around us, that message cuts through the noise like a bell ringing in the fog. There's more, though. In the dream, a pope is struck down during the storm. Many believe this part symbolized a martyr pope, or a leader who would suffer or even die amid the church trials. Then another pope rises, chosen quickly. He succeeds in guiding the ship firmly between the two pillars. Only then does peace return. Now, to be clear, the dream is private revelation, not binding doctrine. Catholics are not required to believe it, and the Church hasn't issued any official interpretation. But, for generations, this vision has been seen as prophetic, encouraging, and spiritually grounded. It's not a roadmap, it's a reminder, a reflection of truths we already hold, that Jesus in the Eucharist is the heart of the Church, and Mary is the surest guide to her Son. What struck me most when I first heard it was how relevant it felt. Not just a historical curiosity, but as a blueprint for peace in the middle of spiritual war. Because let's be honest, sometimes the church does feel like it's in a storm. And the temptation is to panic, or try to steer by our own strength, or jump ship entirely. Like Peter in Matthew 14:30-31, but seeing the wind strong, he was afraid. And when he began to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus, stretching forth his hand, took hold of him, and said to him, O thou of little faith, why dost thou doubt? But this dream gently but firmly points us back to the center. Stay close to the Eucharist, stay close to Mary, stay faithful. God will calm the sea, like in Mark 4:39. And rising up, he rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was made a great calm. Last up in this tier, we have papal resignations. It's rare, but it happens. Before Pope Benedict XVI resigned in 2013, the last pope to resign was in 1415. That was Pope Gregory XII, and his resignation helped end the Western Schism. A wild time when there were 3 rival popes, all claiming authority at the same time, which we will get into in a later tier. Even further back, Pope Celestine V resigned in 1294. He was a humble monk who never wanted the job in the first place, and after 5 months as Pope, he stepped down and returned to a life of prayer. Benedict XVI's resignation was peaceful, prayerful, and deeply humble. He even visited Celestine's tomb before announcing it. It reminded me, the papacy isn't about claiming to power. It's about serving Christ, and sometimes that means stepping aside. Well, that's tier 2, and if you're still here with me, thank you. The Church's history is full of beauty and messiness, saints and sinners, exile and restoration, but what comes next is where the iceberg really starts to get strange. Tier 3 is where mystics start to have visions of popes, prophecies, spiritual battles, and whispers from Fatima begin to rise to the surface. And yeah, we're going there. All right, we're delving deeper in the depths into Tier 3 visions, mystics, and prophetic shadows. So far, we've explored the structure of the papacy, what it is, how it works, and where it came from. But Tier 3 takes us somewhere different. These are the moments when popes appear in dreams, in visions, even in prophecies about the end of days. And while not all of what we've covered here is official church teaching, much of it has lived on in the church's collective memory for centuries. Just a quick note before we go further. These visions and prophecies fall under what the church calls private revelation. That means you're not required to believe them. You're free to find them inspiring, intriguing, or even questionable. What matters is how they've stirred hearts, shaped imaginations, and in some cases, pointed toward a deeper truth. So let's keep going, one layer deeper, starting with Pope Leo XIII and the 100 Years of Satan's Power. In 1884, something happened to Pope Leo XIII that left a permanent mark not just on him, but on the life of the church. The story goes like this. After celebrating Mass one morning, Leo XIII was walking away from the altar when he suddenly stopped. His face went pale. He stood completely still, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. It lasted for what witnesses describe as 10 full minutes. When he finally came to, he looked shaken, deeply disturbed. He didn't speak to the people around him. He went straight to his study. And what he said next would ripple through Catholic history. He told his staff that he had heard a conversation between Jesus and Satan. And what he said next would ripple through Catholic history. He told his staff that he heard a conversation between Jesus and Satan. Satan, in this vision, boasted to the Lord. He claimed that he could destroy the church if only he were given more power and more time, specifically 100 years. Christ's reply, "You have the time, you have the power, do with them what you will." Leo XIII understood the gravity of what he had just experienced. He saw it not just as a private mystical moment, but as a real warning, a spiritual turning point. And so, without delay, he did what any good pope and pastor would do. He went to prayer. That very day, he composed the prayer to St. Michael the Archangel, a bold militant invocation of asking the Prince of the Heavenly Host to defend the Church from the snares of the devil. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the Heavenly Host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. He then ordered to be prayed after every low Mass throughout the world. And for 80 years, that prayer echoed daily in churches everywhere, from grand cathedrals to humble mission chapels. He then ordered it to be prayed after every low Mass throughout the world, and for 80 years, that prayer echoed daily in churches everywhere, from grand cathedrals to humble mission chapels. Now, to be clear, the 100 years part of the vision has never been declared official church teaching. It's part of the private revelation, and Catholics are not required to believe it. Some question the precise details. Others point out that it wasn't publicly documented until years after Leo's death. But even so, it rings true in ways that are hard to ignore. Thinking about the 20th centuries, just after 1884 came 2 world wars, the rise of atheistic communism, The Holocaust, more revolutions, the spread of secularism, and a deep crisis of faith inside and outside the church. Some Catholics have speculated that this century of spiritual trial was exactly what Leo's vision had warned us about. If that's the case, it makes the prayer even more powerful, even more urgent, because we're not just praying out of habit, we're praying as soldiers in a real spiritual war. The good news, Christ is still king, Michael still fights, and the gates of hell still haven't prevailed. This prayer was never meant to be superstition, it was meant to be an armor. A reminder that yes, evil is real, but God is greater, and he has not left us unarmed. A reminder that yes, evil is real, but God is greater, and he has not left us unarmed. So maybe, whether or not you say it after Mass, it's a good time to bring this prayer back into your daily life. The devil hasn't stopped prowling, but the church hasn't stopped standing either. And Saint Michael is still defending. Next up, we have the prophecy of Saint Malachi, the list of popes. Okay, this one's controversial but fascinating. In the 12th century, an Irish archbishop named Saint Malachi supposedly received a vision while visiting Rome. In that vision, he saw a long list of future popes, 112 in total, each described by a short Latin phrase. These phrases weren't names. They were poetic titles, like Pastor Angelicus, or the Glory of the Olive, and incredibly, many of them have loosely matched historical popes. For example, From the Labor of the Sun was interpreted by some as Pope John Paul II, born during a solar eclipse. Glory of the Olive was tied to Pope Benedict XVI, whose monastic name referenced peace. The final pope on the list, Peter the Roman, who is said to lead the church through great tribulation before the end. Now, the Vatican has never approved this prophecy. It wasn't published until 400 years after Malachi's death, and scholars debate its authenticity, but still, the fact that some phrases seem eerily accurate keeps this list alive in Catholic imagination. I try to hold these things loosely, but I admit, it's hard not to wonder. Next up, the third secret of Fatima, the Bishop in White. You've probably heard of Our Lady of Fatima and the three children who saw visions of the Blessed Mother in Portugal in 1917. But did you know that part of the Fatima message involved a pope being attacked? The third secret, revealed decades later, described a bishop dressed in white climbing a mountain, weeping and praying for the church. At the top, he is killed in a violent attack by soldiers, while many others, bishops, priests, and faithful, also perish. When the Vatican released this vision in 2000, it interpreted it as a symbolic foretelling of John Paul II's assassination attempt in 1981. He himself believed Our Lady of Fatima saved his life. But some people argue there's more to the secret, something yet unrevealed. They point to inconsistencies or speculate about an apocalyptic warning. The Church's official stance is that the full secret has been revealed. Still, the image of a pope under fire, literally and spiritually, feels more relevant now more than ever. Next up, we have mystics and popes, Saint Hildegard, Anne Catherine Emmerich, and others. Throughout history, mystics and saints have claimed to receive visions involving popes. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century visionary and doctor of the Church, wrote of a time when the papacy would suffer internal confusion and trials, though she didn't name names. Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, 19th century mystic, describes seeing two popes during a time of great spiritual crisis. Her visions also included vivid imagery of a false church rising up to oppose the true one. Now, these are private revelations, meaning Catholics are not required to believe them, and they should always be interpreted cautiously, but they reflect a consistent theme that the papacy is not immune from suffering, and in fact, it's often at the center of the storm. Next up, popes and exorcism. Yeah, it's a real thing. One of the lesser known facts about the papacy is that popes have authorized and even performed exorcisms. In 1972, Pope Paul VI gave a strong address warning that the smoke of Satan had entered the church. Pope John Paul II reportedly performed a minor exorcism on a possessed woman brought to a general audience. Pope Leo XIII, after his famous vision, is believed to have performed a full exorcism rite and revived the church prayers for deliverance. The papacy isn't just ceremonial, it's spiritual warfare. When the church appoints a pope, she's placing a man at the head of a very real battle for truth, for souls, and for the church's survival. That's something we don't hear much about, but it's worth remembering. This tier shows the invisible weight of the papacy. The popes we see in white robes and balcony speeches are also men walking through spiritual fire, some of it literal, some prophetic, some known only to God. And yet, somehow, the office still stands. In Tier 4, we're going deeper still, into exiles, schisms, and anti-popes. And the question will start to rise, how do we know the papacy is still intact when history gets this messy? Let's delve deeper. We've just entered the Tier 4. Schism, secrets, and spiritual war. Alright, so far, we've talked about the power of the papacy, visions that surround it, and the weight it carries. But what happens when that power is challenged? When the very unity of the church seems to fracture? In Tier 4, we're going into times of division, betrayal, and confusion. Those aren't fun stories, but they're part of the truth, and somehow they only make the promise of Christ that the gates of hell shall not prevail even more incredible. Starting us strong with the Avignon papacy, when the Pope abandoned Rome. For nearly 70 years in the 14th century, the Pope didn't live in Rome. He lived in Avignon, France, a beautiful city, sure, but far from the tomb of St. Peter. It started in 1309 when Pope Clement V, a Frenchman, moved the papal court to Avignon due to instability in Rome and growing French influence. But here's the issue. Rome wasn't just a city. It's the spiritual center of the church, the place where Peter was martyred, where Paul preached, where the church's heart beats. Over the next 7 decades, 7 popes in a row ruled from Avignon. Some were holy, others were deeply political, but the church suffered for it, both spiritually and symbolically. This exile weakened the church's unity and created distrust. Even faithful Catholics started to ask, if the Pope won't return to Peter's city, what does that mean for us? The papacy eventually returned to Rome in 1377, largely due to the fire and persistence of St. Catherine of Siena, who we talked about in Tier 2. But by then, the damage was done. Next, we have the Western Schism, when there were 3 popes at once. This is arguably the darkest chapter in papal history. After the Pope returned to Rome, confusion erupted over who should lead next. In 1378, the cardinals elected Pope Urban VI, but soon regretted it, claiming he was too harsh and erratic. So, they elected a second pope, Clement VII, who ruled from Avignon. And just like that, the church was split. 2 popes, 2 sets of cardinals, 2 lines of succession. It got worse. In 1409, a group of bishops tried to fix it by deposing both claimants and electing a third pope, Alexander V. So for a time, the Catholic world had three men claiming to be the true pope. This crisis, called the Western Schism, lasted nearly 40 years. Entire nations were split on who to follow. Saints like Saint Vincent Ferrer ended up supporting the wrong pope, not out of malice, but confusion. The whole mess was finally resolved at the Council of Constance from 1414 to 1418, which deposed or accepted the resignation of all three and elected Pope Martin V, restoring unity. But here's what amazes me. The office itself never broke. Through all that chaos, the promise of Christ endured. The church emerged wounded, but alive. Next up, we have anti-popes. False popes with real power. Anti-pope might sound like a medieval insult, but it's a real term in church history. An anti-pope is someone who claims to be pope without valid election or authority, usually during times of schism or political manipulation. And there have been over 30 of them. Some were blatant frauds, others were elected by confused rival factions, and some even had large followings and armies. One famous example is anti-pope Felix V, who reigned in the 15th century and was even crowned with a papal tiara. He eventually submitted and repented. The church, with wisdom and patience, always recenters on valid succession, unity, and charity, not on private claims or personal pride. As a reminder, authority in the church is not about charisma or power, but about apostolic continuity and obedience. Finally, for this tier, we come to the prophecy of a future persecuted pope. Many mystics and saints have spoken, not about a current pope, but about a future pope, one who would suffer greatly. We've already touched on Fatima and Anne Catherine Emmerich in tier 3, but the theme shows up again and again. Pope forced to flee Rome, the church going underground, a martyr pope leading in exile. One vision from St. Pius X, a canonized pope, described seeing his successor fling over the bodies of his brothers. Even non-visionaries like Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict VI, spoke openly about a future smaller, poorer, more faithful church, one refined by persecution. Don't say this out of to cause fear, but it reminds me that the papacy isn't about comfort, it's about the cross. Whether it's Peter crucified upside down or a future pope facing persecution, the office has always been a witness to Christ's suffering and victory. That's tier 4. It's messy, painful, confusing, but it's real. And honestly, it makes the papacy even more miraculous to me. Because no institution, no dynasty, no kingdom in the world has survived what the papacy has and remained intact. And we're not done yet. In tier 5, we're heading all the way to the bottom. Spiritual shadows, exorcisms, martyrdoms, martyr popes, and the question of what holds all of this together. Let's keep going. Well, we've done it. We've hit the bottom. Tier 5. Blood, fire, and the rock that will not break. We've seen the structure, the saints, the visions, the schisms, but this tier, this is the weight beneath it all. The papacy doesn't just survive political power plays, it survives satanic hatred. And the men who've worn the fisherman's ring had often paid in blood for the truth they carry. Let's descend one last time. This is the bottom of the iceberg. This is where we stop talking about the papacy like a title and start seeing it for what it really is, a target, a burden, a cross. The visible sign of Christ's promise, and therefore the visible target of hell's fury. The deeper I went into this tier, the more I realized something. No earthly institution should have survived what the papacy has gone through, but it did, and it still does. Let me show you why. First up, More than Peter, forgotten martyr popes. It all begins with martyrdom. According to early church tradition, Pope St. Peter the Fisherman, the Rock, was crucified upside down in Rome around 64 AD during Nero's brutal persecution of Christians. Why upside down? Because Peter didn't consider himself worthy to die in the same way as his Savior. His tomb still lies beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, the entire heart of Catholicism. Our prayers, our masses, our pilgrimages is literally built atop the bones of man who died for Christ. And every pope who's followed him has known that. It's not a throne, it's a cross, but Peter wasn't alone. In the early centuries of the church, becoming pope was almost a death sentence. The world was not kind to truth. And Satan doesn't ignore shepherds. Pope Sixtus II was arrested during the celebration of Mass and beheaded alongside 4 deacons in 258 AD. Pope Pontian was exiled to the mines of Sardinia, condemned to forced labor, where he died in suffering in isolation. Pope Fabian was executed simply for being pope, nothing more. His faith was his only crime. And there's one you may have never heard of, Pope St. Martin I, prison, beaten, and forgotten. In the 7th century, Martin stood up against a rising heresy called monotheism, claimed that Jesus had only a divine will, not a human one. Martin said no. Christ is fully God and fully man. The Byzantine emperor didn't take that well. He had Martin kidnapped, dragged across the empire to Constantinople, imprisoned, humiliated, tortured, and finally exiled to the cold shores of Crimea. There, without trial or mercy, Martin was left to die. No army came to his aid, no public outcry saved him. He died alone, but unbent. Today, he is honored as a saint and martyr, but for centuries, his name was nearly forgotten, and it makes you wonder, how many popes have suffered in silence? How many chose to bleed quietly so the truth could live loudly? By the year 314, when Christianity was finally legalized, over 30 popes had died as martyrs. That's not just church history, that's spiritual legacy. The papacy wasn't founded on power, it was baptized in blood. Pope Pius XII, the Pope who faced the Nazis in the shadow of the Reich. Pope Pius XII, his name sparks controversy even now. Some call him silent in the face of evil. Others see him as a hidden hero, a shepherd fighting a wolf with the cloak of silence and the sword of discretion. The truth? It's more complex than most people know, and far more courageous than many have been led to believe. Before the papacy, a warning against darkness. Before he even wore white, Eugenio Pacelli served as a Vatican diplomat and then as Secretary of State. In 1937, with Hitler's shadow spreading across Europe, he helped draft one of the most direct papal condemnations of Nazism, mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern. It was smuggled into Germany, secretly printed, and read aloud from Catholic pulpits across the country. It condemned the Nazi regime's racism, idolatry of the state, and violations of God-given human dignity. And the Nazis were furious. Pacelli had drawn a line in the sand, and they knew it. Behind the scenes, the hidden war. When Pacelli became Pope Pius XII in 1939, Hitler had already annexed Austria and invaded Poland. The world was at war, and now the church had a new pope, one Hitler loathed and feared. Unlike political leaders who spoke in fiery declarations, Pius chose the path of quiet resistance. He opened churches, monasteries, and convents across Italy to shelter Jews. He authored the forging of baptismal certificates and identity papers. He instructed bishops and priests to do whatever was necessary to protect innocent lives, even if it meant breaking laws or risking their own. According to records from Yad Vashem, over 4,000 Jews were hidden in Vatican properties alone. Some historians estimate that Pius XII's network saved hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives across Europe. The Nazis knew what he was doing. They referred to him as the mouthpiece of the Jews. Hitler was reportedly so enraged by Pius's influence that he had discussed invading the Vatican, abducting the Pope. And here's where it gets even more remarkable. Pius XII wrote a letter of resignation ahead of time, declaring that the moment he was captured, the papacy was considered vacant. This would strip Hitler of any symbolic victory. He would never be able to claim that he controlled the Pope. Let that sink in. This wasn't just diplomacy, this was martyrdom in slow motion. Man fully prepared to lose his freedom, his legacy, even his life, to protect the body of Christ and the Jewish people. After the war, truth and accusations. After the war, Jewish leaders praised him. Golda Meir, the future Prime Minister of Israel, wrote, "When fearful martyrdom came to so many of our people, the voice of the Pope was raised for the victims. Chief Rabbi of Rome even converted to Catholicism, taking the name Eugenio in honor of Pius. But decades later, revisionist history began to spread, largely from fictional works like The Deputy, painting Pius as cold and indifferent. It's a claim not backed by the actions of the man himself or by those he risked everything to save. Pope Pius XII didn't wear a crown of gold. He wore the weight of silence, not because he was afraid, because he knew, in a world listening for excuses to kill, one wrong word could mean thousands more deaths. He chose silence not of cowardice, but as a cloak for courage, shepherd hiding his sheep in the folds of his cassock, while hell closed in all around him." Pope John Paul II, the Bullet and the Mercy. May 13, 1981, St. Peter's Square. The crowd is buzzing with joy. Children are lifted onto shoulders. Flags are waving. Pope John Paul II, charismatic and joyful as always, moves through the crowd, the open-air Pope-mobile. He smiles, he waves, he blesses, and then bang. The Turkish gunman named Mehmet Ali Agha fires 4 rounds at close range. The Pope crumples backward. Blood spills onto the white robes. Chaos erupts. He's rushed to Gemelli Hospital, barely alive, his body riddled with internal injuries. He loses over 70% of his blood, and somehow he survives. But for Pope John Paul II, this was no coincidence. May 13th wasn't just any date. It was the anniversary of the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima, the day in 1917 when 3 shepherd children saw the Blessed Virgin in Portugal. One of those visions, the so-called Third Secret of Fatima, described a bishop in white being shot among the ruins of a persecuted church. Now the prophecy seemed to have a face, his face. John Paul believed it was Our Lady of Fatima who turned the bullet's path. The assassin shot to kill, but the bullet missed vital arteries by millimeters. Years later, the Pope would visit the very shrine of Fatima and offer the bullet to the Virgin. That same bullet now rests solemn and glintly in the crown of her statue. Mercy in the cell. The story didn't end in blood and continued in mercy. In 1983, just 2 years after the attempt, John Paul visited his would-be killer in prison. Cameras captured the image, the Pope in white leaning forward in the gray shadows of a prison cell, face to face with the man who tried to murder him. He didn't go to condemn, he went to forgive. He spoke in private. John Paul later said, "What we talked about must remain a secret between him and me. I spoke to him as a brother." Witness of weakness. This was the same man who stood against atheistic communism, who helped spark the fall of the Iron Curtain, who inspired the Solidarity movement in Poland and brought moral courage to the world stage. Yet, at his most powerful moment, he bore witness not with speeches or strength, but from a hospital bed, the rosary in one hand and forgiveness on his lips. That's the papacy. Not the power of thrones, but the power of the cross. Power made perfect in weakness. Next up, direct promise of Christ. In Matthew 16:18, Jesus turns to a trembling fisherman and speaks words that shook history. And I say to thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. It's not poetic language, that's divine covenant. In the Greek, the phrase gates of Hades doesn't just mean death, it refers to the entire realm of evil, the underworld itself. In ancient times, city gates were symbols of power and authority, the seat of strategy where war plans were made. So when Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail, he's not describing a defensive position. He's telling Peter hell will plan, hell will attack, but it will lose. And that's because Peter was strong. He wasn't. He denied Jesus 3 times. He sank in the water. He got things wrong. But Jesus still chose him and gave him authority. That tells me something. The papacy isn't built on the virtue of man. It's built on the authority of Christ, working through weakness. And that's why it endured. Torture, heresy, war, betrayal. Still, the chair of Peter stands. Because Jesus didn't say, you are Peter, you'll do a pretty good job. He said, I will build. The weight of the keys. And in the very next verse, Matthew 16:19, Jesus gives Peter something more. And I will give to thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind upon earth, it shall be bound also in heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt loose upon earth, it shall be loosed in heaven. It's not symbolic. It's jurisdictional authority, spiritual power that echoes Isaiah 22, where the king gives the steward keys to rule in his name. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will call my servant Ahiam, son of Helshias, and I will clothe him with thy robe, and will strengthen him with thy girdle, and will give thy power into his hand, and he shall be as father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to the house of Judah. And I will lay the key of the house of David upon his shoulder, and he will open, and none shall shut. And he shall shut, and none shall open. Isaiah 22:22 is seen as prefiguration of the authority Christ gives in Peter in Matthew 16:19. Key of David, key of the kingdom, opening, shutting, binding, loosing. Ahiam as a royal steward, Peter as chief apostle and vicar of Christ. It's staggering. The Pope is not just the Bishop of Rome, he's visible steward of Christ's authority on earth. With those keys comes a cost. Because Satan doesn't attack empty thrones. He attacks what threatens them. And the Pope, the visible sign of unity, truth in Christ's kingship, is target number 1. Popes aren't superheroes, they're men. Flesh and blood, some have been holy, others flawed. But through them all, the same Spirit has held up the promise. In the papacy, we don't see the greatness of men, we see the mercy of God. The promise didn't depend upon them being perfect, depended on Jesus being faithful, and he is. The papal spiritual battles you never heard of. What most people don't realize is that the Pope doesn't just deal with public pressure, they carry spiritual suffering too. Not just bullets or betrayals that haunt the papacy. There's another war, invisible but fierce. Pope Pius VI, shaken by a sexual revolution and post-Vatican II confusion, once said, the church is in a state of self-destruction. When he released Humanae Vitae, he wept, not because he doubted the truth of the teaching, because he knew how violently it would be rejected, and he stood firm anyway. St. Pius V, centuries earlier, fasted and prayed the rosary during the Battle of Lepanto. The Christian fleet won against impossible odds. He gave all the credit to Our Lady, and created the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. Pope Benedict XVI, a rare moment of vulnerability, admitted that he often felt darkness pressing down upon him as Pope. Modern exorcists have confirmed what many suspect. The papacy is under constant demonic attack. Because if the shepherd falls, the sheep scatter. If you are the enemy, Wouldn't you go straight for the shepherd? The papacy is exorcist, the final line of defense. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth repeating. Pope isn't just a global leader, he's the chief spiritual defender of the church. Pope Leo XIII, after his terrifying vision of Satan, boasting before Christ, composed a St. Michael prayer and ordered it said after every Mass for decades. He made it part of the daily life of the church. Pope Pius VI, seeing confusion within the church, declared, "The smoke of Satan has entered the sanctuary." John Paul II, the same pope who forgave his assassin, also reportedly performed a minor exorcism of the Vatican on a woman who was brought to one of his audiences. There's a reason the devil hates the papacy, because it's a visible sign that Christ kept his promise. It's the one thing the enemy can't fully counterfeit. That's why we pray for the Pope. That's why we protect him. Not because he's perfect, but because he's on the front line. This isn't just theology, it's war. And somehow, through it all, the keys are still being held. This is the bottom of the iceberg where theology meets blood. Politics fall away, where the real fight begins. Next up, the stonecutters. Satan's ongoing plan to undermine the papacy. In the 1800s, the church wasn't just facing outside pressure, it was facing targeted infiltration. One of the most striking examples comes from a group called Alta Vendita, an Italian branch of Freemasonry active during the 19th century. They weren't hiding their intentions, in fact, they wrote them down. A document called the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, available on Amazon, laid out a long-term plan to undermine the Catholic Church from within, not by attacking it outright, but by gradually corrupting its thinking, formation, and leadership. Their goal wasn't to destroy the papacy through violence, it was to change it from the inside by slowly influencing future generations of clergy and theologians. One line for the document reads, "The work we are about to undertake is not the work of a day, nor of a month, nor of a year. It may last many years, a century perhaps. What we must seek is the Pope, suitable to our purposes." This wasn't speculation, it was exposed and taken seriously. Pope Pius IX ordered the document to be published in full with approval from the Vatican as a warning to the faithful. Later, Pope Leo XIII also condemned Freemasonry multiple times, especially in his encyclical Humanum Genus. Not conspiracy, just caution. Now, this doesn't mean every theory out there is true. The Church has always cautioned us not to chase shadows or give too much power to rumor. It does mean we shouldn't be naive. The Catechism is clear. The Church will enter the glory of the kingdom only through this final Passover, when she will follow her Lord in his death and resurrection. It also says that a final trial will shake the faith of many. Deception will come, and the enemy will appear even within Christ herself, not to destroy her from the outside, but to mislead from within. So whether you believe infiltration is still happening today or not, this is much is certain. Satan's strategy hasn't changed. He doesn't just rage from the outside, he whispers from within, trying to confuse, distort, and wear down the truth. And where does he aim his arrows first? At the Pope. Because the papacy is the last visible defense of the Church's unity. The enemy can discredit, confuse, or corrupt the office, even just in the minds of the faithful. He knows the damage can ripple far. For Christ has already told us, the gates of hell will not prevail. Final reflection. Why it still stands. After everything we've seen, the attacks, the martyrdoms, the betrayals, the spiritual battles, the infiltration attempts, it would be easy to think the papacy shouldn't have collapsed by now, but it hasn't. Not because of political genius, not because of tradition from tradition's sake, and definitely not because popes have always gotten it right. It still stands because Jesus said it would. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That wasn't a metaphor, it was a covenant. Not just with Peter the man, but with the office, with the rock. The covenant has been tested by fire, by blood, by heresy, betrayal, bullets, and Satan himself, but the rock hasn't broken. Because this office, the papacy, isn't held up by one man, it's held up by Christ. So how does it exist? The Roman Empire fell, kings fell, dictators fell. There have been 266 popes, some saints, some sinners, and yet the office remains still breathing, still praying, still leading, and maybe, if you've fallen away, or been disillusioned, or just confused by the mess of it all, maybe this is your reminder. The church was never promised to be clean and easy, she was promised to be true. And the truth doesn't always come with comfort. Sometimes it comes with a cross. So yes, the papacy is strange, it's beautiful, scarred, mysterious, and yes, imperfect. But that's how I know it's real. Because no human institution could survive this long unless God was holding it up. And He is. If this moved you, share it. Not for views, but because people are hurting. They are disillusioned. They've been lied to. But the truth, the full truth, is far deeper and far more beautiful than most people realize. And I think it's time we start digging again. You've been watching Veil and Keys, where we look beyond the headlines, beneath the surface, and into the sacred. Something here stirred your heart. Don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, share, leave a comment about what surprised you the most, and most of all, pray. The church is deeper than you were told, and the veil is thinner than you think. See you in the next descent. God bless.